You walk into a clothing store and pay $50 for a shirt. But here's the strange part. The factory that actually made it never received that $50. By the time the shirt reaches the rack, money has already gone into fabric, labor, packaging, shipping, warehouses, marketing, and retail. So if the factory gets only part of the final price, how does it make money? The answer starts long before the shirt reaches the store. The name on your shirt usually isn't the factory that made it. Many clothing brands design and sell garments, then place production orders with manufacturers that operate the factories. The factory receives specifications, quantities, quality requirements, and a deadline. It then has to turn fabric, workers, machines, and time into thousands of identical shirts for an agreed price. Here's where the clothing business gets interesting. The brand on your shirt doesn't necessarily own the factory that made it. Many brands focus on designing products, building demand, and selling to customers, while independent manufacturers handle the actual production. That means one factory can make clothes for several different buyers, and the machines inside may produce a completely different order next week. So, how does a factory get work? A brand or buyer sends the manufacturer a design, fabric requirements, quantity, quality standards, and delivery date. The factory studies the garment, estimates how much material and labor it will require, and works out a price. If both sides agree, the buyer places the order. Only then does the factory prepare to turn one approved design into thousands of identical garments. But why order 50,000 shirts instead of just a few? Because making the first shirt can require much of the same preparation as making the thousandth. Fabric has to be prepared, patterns arranged, machines set up, workers organized, and quality requirements established. If all that setup produces only one shirt, the cost per garment can be enormous. Spread the same preparation across thousands, and each shirt carries only a tiny share of it. This is why factories love huge orders. Once a production line is ready, making thousands of the same shirt lets the factory keep repeating the same process. Workers stay on the same tasks, machines keep running, and materials move continuously through the line. Instead of constantly stopping to prepare a new product, the factory can turn one setup into thousands of finished pieces, and that can push the cost of each shirt lower. Now imagine the order grows to 100,000 shirts. The factory still needs fabric, labor, thread, labels, and packaging for every piece. But many costs of preparing that order can now be spread across an enormous production run. And at this scale, even tiny savings matter. Save just 10 cents on each shirt, and across 100,000 pieces, that's $10,000. This is where volume starts changing the economics. So what does the factory actually get for that $50 shirt? It might be only a fraction of the retail price, say around $7 in our simplified example, and even that $7 isn't pure profit. It has to cover the fabric, labor, thread, labels, packaging, factory overhead, and other production costs. Whatever remains after those expenses is the factory's margin. So the $50 price tag you see in the store tells you surprisingly little about what the manufacturer actually earns. So where does the factory's money actually go? Start with the most obvious thing, fabric. Before a single shirt reaches a sewing machine, the factory may need thousands of yards of material for one large order. And because every shirt consumes fabric, even a small change in material cost gets multiplied across tens of thousands of pieces. That's why fabric can be one of the biggest costs in clothing production. But fabric doesn't always cost the same. Cotton prices can move, synthetic fibers depend partly on energy and raw material markets, and transportation or supplier conditions can change what the factory pays. A difference of just 20 cents per shirt sounds tiny. But across an order of 100,000 shirts, that's $20,000 in extra cost. If the factory already agreed on the selling price, much of that increase can come straight out of its margin. Once the fabric arrives, the next challenge is using as much of it as possible. Before cutting begins, shirt pieces are arranged tightly across long layers of fabric, almost like a puzzle. Sleeves can fit beside body panels, and smaller pieces can fill empty spaces. The tighter the layout, the more shirts the factory can cut from the same roll. Because every leftover piece of usable fabric is material the factory already paid for. A few scraps on the cutting table may not look expensive, But multiply that waste across 100,000 shirts, and it can become a serious cost. The factory paid for the entire roll, not just the fabric that ended up in finished clothing. So, better pattern layouts can mean more sellable shirts from the same amount of material. And when margins are already thin, saving even a little fabric on every garment can make a meaningful difference. Once the fabric is cut, the pieces enter the sewing line. But one worker usually doesn't build an entire shirt. Instead, production is broken into separate operations. One worker joins the shoulders, another attaches sleeves, another closes the sides, and another finishes the collar. The shirt moves from station to station, becoming more complete with every step. That assembly line system is what lets a factory produce thousands of nearly identical garments efficiently. On a sewing line, a few seconds can become surprisingly expensive. If one operation takes 5 seconds longer than planned, that delay repeats on every shirt passing through the station. Across hundreds or thousands of shirts, those seconds become hours of lost production. And because the next workers depend on that station, one slow step can reduce the output of the entire line. That balance comes from how workers are organized. Instead of one person sewing an entire shirt, factories divide the job into smaller operations. One worker may sew sleeves, another joins the sides, and another finishes the collar. Each station feeds the next, so the factory can produce thousands of identical shirts much faster. And fabric isn't the only material the factory buys. Every garment may need buttons, zippers, thread, labels, tags, and packaging. Each item seems cheap on its own, but multiply a few cents across tens of thousands of shirts, and these tiny costs quickly become a serious part of the order. But finishing the shirt doesn't mean the factory is finished spending money. Before shipment, workers inspect garments for bad stitching, wrong measurements, stains, and other defects. That inspection takes people, time, and factory space. And when something fails, fixing it adds even more cost. So what happens when a shirt fails inspection? If the problem is small, the factory may repair it and inspect it again. But serious defects can mean remaking the garment, or rejecting it completely. Either way, the factory has already paid for fabric, labor, machine time, and overhead. The more defective shirts it produces, the more money it spends without creating sellable output. Now we can finally estimate what one shirt actually costs the factory. Start with fabric, then add sewing labor, thread, labels, packaging, quality control, and a share of the factory's operating costs. None of these expenses looks enormous by itself, but together, they create the true production cost of the shirt. And the difference between that cost and what the factory charges its customer is where the factory's margin begins. So how does the factory decide what to charge? Before accepting an order, it estimates the materials, labor, production time, packaging, quality control, and overhead required to make each garment. Add those costs together, then add a margin, and the factory has its quoted price. But even a small mistake in that estimate can become expensive when the same price is multiplied across a huge order. A $7 factory price doesn't mean $7 of profit. Most of that money immediately goes toward fabric, labor, trims, packaging, quality control, and overhead. After those costs are paid, only a small amount may remain. That means the factory doesn't necessarily make much money from one shirt. Its economics become powerful when that small margin is repeated across a very large order. This is why an expensive shirt isn't automatically more valuable to the factory. What matters is how much the factory earns on each piece, and how many pieces it can produce. A simple shirt with a small margin, repeated 100,000 times, can generate far more profit than a complicated garment produced in tiny quantities. For the factory, volume can be more powerful than price. Factory costs don't all behave the same way. Some rise with every shirt produced: fabric, thread, trims, packaging, and much of the direct labor. But other costs, like the building, equipment, supervisors, and basic operating expenses, remain even when production slows. These are fixed costs, and the more shirts a factory produces, the more units it has to spread those fixed costs across. This is why an idle factory can lose money surprisingly fast. When production slows, the factory may buy less fabric and use fewer trims, But the building, machines, maintenance, supervisors, and other fixed costs don't simply disappear. With fewer shirts coming off the line, those costs are spread across fewer units. So every empty machine represents capacity the factory is paying for, but not earning from. This is machine utilization. How much of the factory's available production capacity is actually being used? A machine sitting empty still occupies space and still has costs attached to it. But when that same machine spends more of the day producing sellable garments, those costs are spread across more shirts. Higher utilization can improve factory economics, but only until production becomes so crowded that breakdowns, delays, and quality problems begin to rise. Once the factory is busy, production speed becomes another powerful lever. If the same workers and machines can make more sellable shirts in the same amount of time, the factory can spread many of its costs across more units. Even saving a few seconds at one operation can matter when that step is repeated thousands of times. But speed only creates value if the shirts still pass inspection, because producing defects faster doesn't make the factory more efficient. Factory efficiency isn't just about sewing faster, it's about getting more sellable clothing from the same fabric. Workers, machines, space, and time. Less wasted fabric, less waiting between operations, fewer defects, and smoother production all reduce the cost of each garment. And when those tiny improvements are repeated across tens of thousands of shirts, even a few cents saved per piece can become serious money. This is where manufacturing scale becomes powerful. Saving 5 cents on one shirt barely matters, but across 100,000 shirts, that's $5,000. Save another 3 cents in fabric, 2 cents in packaging, and a little labor time, and the gains begin stacking together. Clothing factories don't need one enormous breakthrough. Sometimes improving dozens of tiny costs across a huge order is enough to transform the economics. Now we can follow the shirt beyond the factory. In our simplified example, the manufacturer might sell the shirt for around $7. That $7 has to cover everything we just saw: materials, labor, quality control, overhead, and a small margin. But the shirt's journey isn't finished. Before a customer ever sees a $50 price tag, several more businesses and costs still have to be added. So why can a shirt that leaves the factory at around $7 end up priced at $50? Because the factory price is only the beginning. The shirt still has to be shipped, imported, stored, marketed, distributed, and sold through a retail business that has its own employees, rent, inventory risk, and margin. The $50 price is the final result of an entire chain, not simply the factory price with $43 of pure profit added. That $43 gap does not belong to the factory. Once the shirt leaves manufacturing, more costs begin accumulating. Freight, import duties, warehousing, marketing, distribution, retail employees, store rent, and the risk that some shirts never sell at full price. Different businesses also need their own margins. So the gap between $7 and $50 is really the cost and profit structure of the entire supply chain. Shipping adds another layer to the shirt's cost. The factory may be thousands of miles from the customer, so cartons must be trucked to a port, loaded into containers, transported across borders, unloaded, and delivered again. Every step requires vehicles, workers, fuel, equipment, and time. Spread across thousands of shirts, the shipping cost per garment may look small, but across an entire order, it can become a substantial expense. Crossing a border can add another layer of cost. Depending on the country and product, the importer may have to pay customs duties, taxes, and clearance fees before the shipment can move forward. Those charges don't go back to the factory. They are added after manufacturing and shipping. So by the time the shirt reaches the local warehouse, its cost can already be noticeably higher than when it left the factory. Once the shirts arrive, they still need somewhere to wait. Warehouses charge for space, but storage is only part of the cost. Workers have to receive the cartons, forklifts move them, inventory has to be tracked, and every box occupies valuable space until someone buys it. A shirt sitting on a warehouse shelf isn't earning money yet, but the business is still paying to keep it there. The brand has costs of its own. Before a shirt ever reaches a customer, designers develop the product, teams plan inventory, employees manage suppliers and orders, and the company pays for offices, technology, customer service, and returns. None of those costs appear on the factory floor, but they still have to be paid for by the shirts the brand eventually sells. And we haven't even reached one of the biggest expenses yet: marketing. And this is where the economics can become surprising. In some cases, the brand may spend as much, or even more, marketing a shirt than the factory spent making it. Photography, advertising, creators, store displays, and promotions all cost money. Manufacturing creates the product, but marketing creates the demand. And if nobody notices the shirt, even a perfectly made product can sit unsold. The retailer needs its own margin too. A store has employees, rent, lighting, payment fees, stockroom costs, returns, and merchandise that may eventually have to be discounted. So the price on the rack has to cover more than just the shirt itself. The retailer needs enough left over after all those costs to make carrying the product worthwhile. But not every $50 shirt actually sells for $50. If demand is weaker than expected, the retailer may cut the price to $40, $35, or even lower just to move the inventory. The problem is that most of the costs have already happened. The shirt was still manufactured, shipped, imported, stored, marketed, and placed in the store. So every discount can shrink the margin much faster than it shrinks the price. And this is where clothing becomes risky. A shirt that never sells still consumed fabric, labor, shipping, duties, warehouse space, marketing, and retail space. But unlike a discounted shirt, unsold inventory may bring in little, or sometimes no, revenue at all. Multiply that problem across thousands of garments, and what looked like a profitable collection can turn into a major loss. So why is so much clothing made far from the customers who eventually buy it? Lower labor costs can matter, but that's only part of the answer. Many manufacturing regions have spent decades building dense networks of fabric mills, trim suppliers, skilled workers, logistics companies, and specialized factories. When all of those pieces are close together, clothing can be produced at enormous scale, and often at a lower total cost. Labor cost matters, but it is only one part of the total equation. A factory can pay lower wages and still be more expensive overall if fabric has to travel farther, trims arrive late, production stops waiting for supplies, or quality problems create rework. What matters to the brand is the total cost of getting a finished shirt on time at the quality promised. Cheap labor helps, but only if the rest of the system works too. A clothing factory doesn't make everything itself. It depends on dozens of other businesses for fabric, thread, buttons, zippers, labels, packaging, machine parts, and transportation. When those suppliers are nearby, materials can arrive faster, shortages can be fixed quickly, and production spends less time waiting. That supplier network can be just as important as the factory itself. And this explains why clothing factories often cluster in the same places. Once fabric mills, trim suppliers, skilled workers, technicians, warehouses, and logistics companies are concentrated in one region, being nearby becomes a competitive advantage. Materials travel shorter distances, problems can be solved faster, and factories can respond more quickly to new orders. The bigger the cluster becomes, the more useful that location can become. But there's a trade-off. The farther a factory is from the customer, the farther every shirt has to travel. Finished garments may spend weeks inside trucks, containers, ports, and ships before reaching a warehouse. That adds freight costs, ties up inventory while it's moving, and makes sudden changes harder. So a cheaper factory price doesn't automatically mean a cheaper shirt by the time it reaches the market. And sometimes, speed is worth paying more for. A factory with higher labor costs may still be more valuable if it can produce and deliver shirts much faster. The brand can order smaller quantities, see what customers actually buy, and quickly reorder the winners. That means less money committed to inventory, fewer unsold clothes, and a better chance of having the right product when customers actually want it. And delays have costs that don't appear on the factory invoice. If fabric arrives late, production starts late. If production finishes late, the shipment may miss its scheduled departure. Brands might pay for expensive rush shipping, or the clothes may reach stores after customers have already moved on. A delay of just a few days can ripple through the entire supply chain and turn a cheap order into an expensive mistake. This is why factories love repeat customers. Every new brand requires samples, price negotiations, production planning, quality requirements, and time spent learning how that customer works. But when an existing customer places another order, much of that groundwork is already done. Repeat orders are easier to plan, cheaper to manage, and help keep workers and machines consistently busy, which can make them far more valuable than constantly chasing new customers. and the relationship becomes even more valuable when it lasts for years. A factory that expects regular orders from the same brand can plan production months ahead, reserve machine capacity, prepare materials, and keep experienced workers on familiar products. That predictability reduces uncertainty for the factory and gives it more confidence to invest in better equipment, training, and capacity for future orders. Large orders can also make each shirt cheaper to produce. A factory still has to create samples, prepare patterns, set up machines, organize workers, and plan production whether the order is small or large. With a bigger order, those setup costs are spread across far more shirts. The factory may also buy materials in larger quantities and keep the production line running longer without changing styles, bringing the cost of each shirt down. And factories usually don't try to make every kind of clothing. Many specialize. One factory might focus on basic t-shirts, another on denim, and another on technical jackets. Repeating similar products lets workers build experience, machines stay configured for familiar operations, and suppliers provide the same materials again and again. Over time, specialization can make a factory faster, more consistent, and cheaper at producing the garments it knows best. A t-shirt and a jacket may both be clothing, but they're completely different products to a factory. A basic t-shirt uses relatively few pieces and repetitive sewing operations. A jacket can require multiple fabric layers, pockets, zippers, lining, and many more assembly steps. Every extra operation takes worker time and creates another opportunity for mistakes. That's why factories need different skills, equipment, and production systems for different types of clothing. Even changing the design can cost a factory money. A new style may require different patterns, fabric, thread, trims, machine settings, and sewing operations. The production line has to stop, prepare for the new garment, and workers need time to learn the new sequence. During that changeover, fewer shirts are being produced, so factories prefer longer runs of similar products because every design change creates setup time that has to be paid for. This is why small production runs can become surprisingly expensive. The factory still has to develop samples, prepare patterns, organize materials, configure machines, and set up the sewing line, even if the brand orders only a few hundred shirts. But now those setup costs are divided across far fewer garments. And once the small batch is finished, the factory may have to change the line again. So the smaller the order, the higher the cost per shirt can become. That's why factories often require a minimum order quantity. Before production even starts, the factory spends time developing samples, preparing patterns, buying materials, configuring machines, and organizing the sewing line. If a brand orders too few pieces, those costs can become too large compared with the value of the order. A minimum quantity helps make sure there's enough production to justify all that setup, and enough revenue for the factory to make the order worthwhile. But what happens if the brand cancels? The factory may have already bought fabric, ordered custom trims, scheduled workers, and reserved production capacity. Sometimes thousands of garments are already being sewn, or completely finished. If the customer walks away, those costs don't disappear. The factory may be left with materials and clothing made for a buyer that no longer wants them, turning what looked like a profitable order into a major financial risk. And inventory itself can become dangerous. Every roll of fabric, box of trims, unfinished garment, and completed shirt represents money the factory has already spent. If those products sit in a warehouse instead of being shipped and paid for, that money stays tied up. Meanwhile, workers, suppliers, rent, and electricity still have to be paid. The longer inventory sits, the more storage it consumes, and the greater the risk that it becomes difficult to sell at all. And this leads to one of the most important parts of the factory business: cash flow. A factory may have profitable orders but still run short of cash. It often has to pay for fabric, trims, wages, electricity, and production weeks before the customer pays the final invoice. If too much money goes out before enough comes back in, the factory can struggle to fund the next order. Profit tells you whether the business makes money. Cash flow determines whether it has enough money to keep operating today. So the cheapest factory doesn't always win. One supplier might offer a shirt for a few cents less, but price is only part of the decision. If quality problems create rejected garments, production runs late, or shipments repeatedly miss deadlines, those savings can disappear quickly. Brands often pay slightly more for factories they trust to deliver the right product, at the right quality, at the right time. In manufacturing, reliability can be worth more than the lowest price. And that means speed, quality, and reliability have real economic value. A factory that can finish an order faster helps a brand respond to demand while customers still want the product. Consistent quality means fewer defects, returns, and costly corrections. Reliable delivery helps stores receive inventory when they actually need it. So a factory isn't only selling sewing capacity, it's selling confidence that thousands of garments can be made correctly and arrive when the customer needs them. Automation can change these economics again. Clothing factories can't simply automate every sewing operation because fabric is flexible and many garments still require skilled human handling. But machines can spread and cut fabric, perform repetitive sewing tasks, move materials, and help workers produce more consistently. That can reduce labor time and waste per garment. But automation is expensive to buy and maintain, so it makes the most economic sense when a factory has enough production to keep those machines busy. This creates another interesting opportunity. A factory may already be paying for its building, machines, supervisors, and other fixed costs whether it produces at full capacity or not. If part of the production line is still available, one additional order can fill that unused capacity without requiring another factory. The factory still pays for the fabric, trims, labor, and other costs of making those shirts. But much of its existing infrastructure is already paid for. That means the extra order can sometimes contribute more profit than you might expect. And scale changes the economics even further. Imagine a factory making 1,000 shirts instead of 100,000. Both orders may require samples, patterns, machine setup, supervisors, and factory space. But with the larger order, those costs are spread across far more shirts. The factory may also negotiate better material prices, run production longer without changing styles, and use its machines more efficiently. The result is simple. As production scales, the average cost of making each shirt can fall, even when the factory is spending more money overall. So who actually makes money from your clothes? The answer isn't just the factory or even the brand. A shirt passes through an entire chain of businesses before you buy it. The factory earns a margin for manufacturing it. Shipping companies, warehouses, and retailers earn money for moving, storing, and selling it. The brand uses its share to pay for design, employees, marketing, stores, returns, and unsold inventory. So that $50 price tag isn't one giant profit. It's revenue being divided across an entire clothing business system. So where does the factory's profit actually come from? Usually not from making a huge amount on one shirt. It comes from producing enormous volumes while controlling thousands of tiny costs. A few cents saved on fabric, slightly faster sewing, fewer defects, better material prices, and machines that stay productive may seem insignificant on a single garment. But multiply those savings across hundreds of thousands, or millions of shirts, and small improvements become serious money. The factory business is often a game of tiny margins multiplied by massive volume. So the next time you see a shirt selling for $50, remember what that price actually represents. The factory may receive only a small fraction of it, and keep an even smaller fraction as profit. The rest supports materials, workers, shipping, duties, warehouses, the brand, marketing, stores, and the risk of clothing that never sells. For the factory, the real money isn't hidden inside one expensive shirt. It's created by making huge quantities efficiently, controlling tiny costs, and repeating a small margin again and again. That's how clothing factories actually make money.